Oh, thank you. Of that one. Looking good. Well said. Thank you all so much for being here. Thanks to everyone who was on the stream. And, we really appreciate you all returning for the second week of what will be 12 weeks on The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James, an incredibly essential text, a crucial history for thinking through a crucial moment, which of course is the moment of the Haitian Revolution, as part and parcel of a broader revolutionary ferment that we often limit to the French Revolution as a very sort of Central European sort of turning point. But we're talking about Haiti for reasons that may already be clear, and if not, will definitely become clear as we move forward. Now, before I begin, and particularly because there was a question last week in the chat about how C.L.R. James viewed the mid-century Haitian leaders, Baby Doc and Papa Doc Duvalier, I wanted to mention that I sort of accidentally came across an article this week that James wrote in the mid-60s, and that he called not Black Jacobins, but Black Sans-Culottes. For folks that don't know, this is a very crucial term from the French Revolution that we will return to during the course of this conversation, and it denotes the poorest and most sort of oppressed and excluded Parisian masses, right? Sans-Culottes versus Jacobins, right? The sort of revolutionary grassroots versus the leadership in positions of power. And James begins that article, which is sharply critical of the Duvaliers for their brutality, with a slightly misleading statement. This is James writing in 1964, quote, "The Black Jacobins of the Haitian Revolution of 1791 are the Black Sans-Culottes of 1964. Misleading because while it speaks to the question of the, quote, and this is James that we quoted last week, the obscure creatures of the grassroots struggling against the Duvalier regime, as we will see, this is also a question for the French Revolution. And this was something that James himself had come to realize during the course of the sort of playing out of his understanding of politics in general and the Haitian process in particular. And it's also misleading because it skirts a key question that we'll come back to when it comes to his famous title, which is Black Jacobins a compliment or not, right? Is it good to be a Black Jacobin, or is there something about the relationship between Black Jacobins and Black Sans-Culottes that is, saying something far more critical? That's something we'll come back to. First and foremost, we begin, and this is a sort of practice that we engage in at Abolition School as well, by recapping a little bit of the conversations that we had last week, framing out a bit of what we saw. And if we recall, we went through a lot of context around the book. We didn't dig too much into the text because we were talking about locating the text, locating Black Jacobins in time in a way that will allow us to approach it and understand what James was trying to, what he was trying to accomplish with the book, and particularly this question of who James was when he wrote the text. We said a young, relatively new convert to Marxism and to Trotskyism in particular. When it was written, and this was different moments, 1938, the mid sort of the interwar period, a very fraught period in global history, but also rewritten and edited at least a little bit in 1963. So it's written between these moments, and we tracked a bit of that trajectory. And where it was written for, which was a bit of a surprising piece if folks remember that it was not initially written for the Caribbean, it was written for Africa. Right? He's in London, he's thinking about the sort of coming African revolution. He's one of many that were sort of hopefully and optimistically foreseeing a wave of anti-colonial struggles that then broke out within a couple of decades. But he's thinking far more about Africa than he is about what he calls, of course, the West Indies. And it's only in that appendix that we talked about last week that he, in his words, tries to do for the Caribbean what he had already done for Africa, which is to show that it could move forward without reference to an elsewhere, right? That it could be its own source, its own origin, and that it could be its own sort of revolutionary beginning, right? From its own dynamics. Now, we've already begun to discuss a little bit the relationship between Black Jacobins and its great contemporary text, which is, which is Black Reconstruction by W.E.B. Du Bois, what we studied last semester in our hybrid, and which really forms, in many ways, a core of our Abolition School curriculum, right? We've mentioned the question of Reconstruction already. Luckily for us, James speaks to this directly in his 1971 lectures on the Black Jacobins, one of which offers what he calls a comparative analysis of the two texts. He explicitly writes, in 1971, he says, let me sit down and compare these two texts. So we weren't the only ones wondering how these two books were written at the same time without the knowledge of the other. So James is sitting down to think about how he compares them, and most of which is dedicated with a humility that I think could only have characterized the later CLR James. Definitely not the most humble person when he was younger. The later CLR James, in a very humble way, spends this whole lecture talking about all of the things that Du Bois did better than him, right? The things he understood better, the pieces that he had fitted together and grasped in a more direct way. And on one level, this makes sense, right? Remember that James was writing this book at the same time that Du Bois wrote Black Reconstruction, and so they're writing at the same time, but James is a generation younger. Du Bois was already writing and publishing the essays, for example, that would become Souls of Black Folk when James was born, right? So there's a generational difference. And so when they're writing and doing similar things, they're not doing it on the same footing. And this is part of what James is sensing and feeling. So first and foremost, just to document a little bit of what James thought that Du Bois had done better than him in Black Reconstruction. First, he says that there are many ways in which, as James describes it, I set out to prove it, Dr. Du Bois didn't, he took it for granted. We sort of gestured toward this a little bit last week, but what does it mean? For example, that the West Indies in Africa had history, right? That they could be their own source, that their leaders were great people alongside other great leaders in human history, and that fundamentally, Black people were human, or what Du Bois had called in the sort of preface to Black Reconstruction, ordinary human beings. And here there's two pieces, human and ordinary, right? They're both incredibly important for Du Bois as for James, namely not special, just ordinary and capable of responding to situations in the way that anyone else would. We see that played out in both of these crucial texts. What James was doing was groundbreaking and astonishing to many, not just to Du Bois. Or just not to Du Bois, I should say. Many of the people around James, when they read this book, they were shocked. They were amazed at the history he told, but Du Bois had in a way been thinking this way for a period already. Second, the second thing that James sees Du Bois as having done slightly better than him was that he saw, James sees Africa doing what Haiti did and again seeks to prove it, right? He doesn't just take it for granted. Whereas Du Bois already, according to James, places Africa at the center of history. And the Civil War he places on par with, as he puts it, the Reformation and the French Revolution. These are central turning points in human history, and for folks that haven't fully read Black Reconstruction, the punchline in many ways is that here was, in the aftermath of the Civil War and through the struggle of enslaved people, the highest point of American democracy, a universal project to build emancipatory politics, right? The most democratic the US had ever been, and the closest it ever got to being a true democracy. As James puts it, quote, Du Bois taught me to think in those terms. I ended the Black Jacobins by saying Africa will be free, the Africans will be free. Du Bois doesn't end with that. Du Bois takes the whole of Western civilization, the Reformation and the French Revolution, the Greek experience, and he links them together, right? Okay, this makes sense. But then why does James, even in 1971, which is to say again at the end of his career, describe the Haitian Revolution as he puts it, quote, part of the French Revolution? Maybe this is pedantic of me. He does it very consciously, though. He's pushing back on people that are sort of, that don't want to see the connection between the Haitian Revolution and the French Revolution. These are happening at the same time. They're deeply interconnected. And the question is not the connection, that's undeniable, but to be connected, to be enmeshed, to be intertwined is different from being a part of. In other words, what is the overarching framework? He's still saying in 1971, it's the French Revolution. But if you were to take this piece that he thinks Du Bois did better and take it to its logical extent, surely you would say something like the Haitian Revolution is part of a broader transatlantic revolution that also includes the French Revolution, right? Why would you make the French Revolution the defining framework that Haiti is then measured in terms of? That's a question I have. It's a question I'll leave with you all for now. But it's definitely connected to something we said maybe about James's character, about being very pro-European, being very enamored of European civilization and history. Third, on the question of race, which we raised last time as a peculiarity in James's character as well and his understanding of the world. On the one hand, he pushes back hard on what he calls, quote, black people who believe that they treat us that way because we are black. James is very clear about this. This is in 1971 again. That is not to understand history at all. That is not to understand history at all. And one of his main goals in Black Jacobins is to show, quote, how and when and what are the circumstances under which race prejudice is struck down. In other words, where racism advances, where it retreats, what are the parameters and the struggles that make that movement possible, right? Race is not a uniform and sort of eternal phenomenon for James. It emerges, it can be defeated, it can be pushed back. However, he also recognizes that Du Bois understood better what he calls the psychological elements of racism, how it was experienced and what that experience meant for the struggle, right? And meant for a kind of dialectics of struggle. If you look at someone like Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks, his own experience of white supremacy and struggles with it and confronting it is part of the momentum that builds for him a need to struggle dialectically against that system, right? James, in his own words, says that Black Jacobins was deficient in this aspect. It didn't really get into the psychological piece. Quote, I couldn't do it. Du Bois was as solid on the economic basis, more penetrating, more comprehensive than I was, but he saw something else which few historians could see. He was able to penetrate into the minds of the black slaves who, in addition to doing these political things, had ideas of their own. Du Bois, and this is James still speaking, Du Bois was aware of why the blacks fought and what they thought. And again, he's saying that Du Bois did this better than him. This is something to bear in mind when we're reading through Black Jacobins as well. And the fourth piece that he thinks Du Bois did better than him is that he feels as if Du Bois had a more advanced understanding and approach when it came to Marxism as a method, right? And here's something that's very important and very interesting that we need to pay attention to, because it's got to do with Marxism and it's got to do with method of understanding and of writing and grasping history. According to James, Du Bois didn't simply bring Marxism to the content, in other words, apply Marxism to, in his case, the US Civil War. He studied the material and he drew what CLR James calls Marxist conclusions. This is a quote. He didn't bring the Marxist conclusions to apply to the material. Du Bois uses the material and saw that only the Marxist analysis could fit, and as a result, he went further in regard to the demonstration of the essential verities of Marxism than anybody except Lenin or Marx himself. This is incredibly high praise. James is saying that Du Bois is among the most important contributors to Marxism, not appliers of Marxism, not something specific in particular, right? But someone who's transforming, creating, contributing to Marxism in the process. And it emerges because of the kind of method that he uses. He even mentions, James mentions a really important footnote that we mentioned last semester in our study of Black Reconstruction. It's a footnote on the first page of chapter 10, the crucial chapter on South Carolina, on the commune, essentially, of South Carolina, that Du Bois wanted to call the dictatorship of the black proletariat. And he says in that footnote that his method is inductive. This is just very sort of rough and dirty philosophy, right? Inductive means from the material and the data up. Deductive means from the ideas down. And so what Du Bois is saying is we need to study the reality, right? We need to study that data, study those facts, and from those facts determine the frameworks and the categories for understanding, right? We don't show up with categories, in other words, these Marxist categories, and then just try to impose them onto the material in a way that does violence to that material, right? We have to understand the material first. This is why he says we need to study history inductively. And this is something that James is taking from him. And it's something that I think is actually central, and I always argue this, central to what we could call third world Marxism. If you're looking at Walter Rodney, if you're looking at Amilcar Cabral, Jose Carlos Mariátegui, many other third world Marxists, they're doing the same thing. They're not saying, here's what Marx and other Marxists are saying the idea should be, let's make them fit. They're looking around them at their own reality and saying, how do these ideas fit and not fit? How do they need to be changed, stretched, transformed? Again, Fanon, in the context of Algeria, says that's why Marxist categories always need to be stretched in the colonial context. It's about understanding how they could fit and what we can learn from them, right? One way that this emerges that James is very, very sort of impressed by is the fact that Du Bois is writing about the slave general strike of the black worker in the 1860s, but that's before even the reference point for the general strike. It's not only that he's saying, here's a Marxist idea, the general strike, the workers walk off the job, let's see how that emerged in 1865. He's saying this emerged 4 decades before 1905, which was the reference point for the general strike in Russia, right? So not only is it an example, but it's also an origin, an unrecognized origin, an early source, and it emerges from the places that most Marxists would not look, right? Namely enslaved people. Now, when James says that Du Bois did all of these things better than him in Black Reconstruction, that he was insufficient, or what did he say, deficient in the Black Jacobins, I was surprised, because I think Black Jacobins also already does those things, right? They're already there, at least partially. And we'll see already today how he does the last one in particular, right? How Black Jacobins is an example of this more inductive approach to applying Marxist categories, not in a mechanical way, but in a creative, materialist way. But overall, what James is saying is that while Black Jacobins points in these directions, it does so only what he calls intuitively. He wasn't totally sure what he was doing. He was sort of feeling it out and moving in the right direction. But he thinks that Du Bois understood it better and therefore took it further, right? James doesn't take it to the full length. He did it without fully knowing what he was doing or seeing the full consequences of it, which again makes sense, particularly in his recent radicalization, the sort of orthodoxy that he was operating within. And it's palpable when we think about the tensions within the text, particularly around the question of leadership, right? It's something that feels like it's shifting within the text. Now, we take a look at the tables of contents for, on the one hand, Black Reconstruction, and on the other hand, Black Jacobins. What is it that we see? First of all, when we're looking at table of contents, we're thinking about architecture, right? We're thinking about the structure, the framing of the argument. We're thinking about the understanding behind that framing. These are not accidents, right? Words, individual word choice in certain places when the book might be an accident. The table of contents is not an accident. And we see some very important conceptual and methodological work that both of the authors are doing, and it's very revealing. For those that can't see it, I'll start with the Du Bois over here on the bottom. The chapters in Black Reconstruction, if you haven't read it, go the black worker, the white worker, the planter, the general strike, the coming of the Lord, looking backward, looking forward, and so on. The table of contents for Black Jacobins goes the property, the owners, Parliament and property, the San Domingo masses begin, and the Paris masses complete. And that's not all the way through. Then Toussaint, and then all this stuff. But I want to draw your attention mostly to the first chapter, the first chapters, right? Du Bois says the black worker and the white worker. James says the property and the owners. Now, they're both, the first thing that we can see is that they're both doing their materialist analysis of their reality, right? They're both mapping out a class constellation that stretches and transforms received Marxist categories. In neither case is this what Marx was doing or what most Marxists were doing, right? To do a materialist class analysis of the role of slavery within capitalism as a broader system. This is not what Marxists are doing. This is transforming, this is stretching. We're gonna see much, much more of this. And they're both doing it in an inductive sense. They're saying, let's look at the class structure in Haiti, in San Domingo, and see what fits and what categories fit. There's a difference though, right? And it gets back to what he was saying about Du Bois not trying to prove things, but already just sort of making them clear, right? Du Bois says the black worker and the white worker. The black worker are enslaved black people in the US South, right? He's not trying to say enslaved people, he doesn't say the property, he says the black worker because that's what he takes to be true. James, and we'll see a bit more when we dig into this first chapter, by starting with the property is both saying something that's undeniably true, right? That under this system, these human beings were property, but there's also elements of him trying to make that case in a way that he doesn't think that Du Bois is spending his time doing that, right? So Du Bois, in a certain way, goes further with just the framing out of the black worker versus the white worker, even if they're both doing kind of the same thing. Then what? Du Bois says the general strike. James says the San Domingo masses begin. Now, the first thing is that James is paraphrasing this sort of aristocratic observer of the French Revolution named Chateaubriand, who very famously wrote, "The patricians began the revolution, the plebeians completed it." The patricians began it, the plebeians completed it. James is changing that and saying the masses, the San Domingo masses begin it, and the Paris masses complete. Both the masses playing a bigger role and the source and the origin being relocated into the Haitian process. So there's something very, very interesting happening there. And there's something, you know, there are a few pieces to identify. One is the way that even in what Chateaubriand is identifying about the French Revolution, this is already seeping its way, that, you know, in the moment that James is writing, into understandings of the French Revolution, that there's a more complex class element, you know, playing out. When Chateaubriand said the patricians began the revolution, he's saying the aristocrats actually set it off. They didn't even mean to. And then the plebeians or the poor completed it, right? This is something that we began to think about, that we'll begin to think about this week when it comes to the question of who creates the possibility and the space for enslaved people to enter history, right? And a space to enter is going to be a crucial thing for James. Second, we can raise the question of where is the bourgeoisie in this allegedly bourgeois revolution? The French Revolution, we'll say more about this in a second, is understood to be led by the bourgeoisie for the sake of creating a capitalist society in Marxist frameworks. No mention of the bourgeoisie here. Third, what is the central role of the masses in both of these books, right? And fourth, CLR James is maintaining some of these these sort of elements when it comes to observing the French Revolution and its dynamics, while also opening onto a transatlantic frame that is not present in most understandings of the French Revolution. And then we could think as well, how is it that the Paris masses complete this? Is that a closure? Is that an enclosing of the Haitian Revolution into the French Revolution, again, as we already sort of raised as an open question? Now, to think a little bit more about these pieces, we can look at, and this is probably not super visible to anyone, a very, very basic chart and understanding of the movement of categories in very traditional Orthodox Marxism. And I want to be careful because there's plenty of Marxists that don't understand history this way. It's been shown to be insufficient in terms of grasping and understanding the way that history moves, but there are basic pieces that we need to understand because it's the reference point for James when he's talking about where the French Revolution fits, right? So first and foremost, you've got this movement of history which is moves according to an upward trajectory and arrow. That arrow is the growth of what Marxists call the forces of production, the capacity to produce things over time. This isn't all going to be relevant, but I'll just sort of run through some of the basic pieces. It goes up over time because human society is able to produce more things over time, and this becomes very important when Marxists are trying to determine what future communism should look like versus the origin of this story down here, which is a sort of primitive collective society, right? According to Marx, many Marxists, society, this transformation is dialectical, meaning it emerges through clashes, divisions, and struggle. And it's materialist, meaning that those clashes and struggles emerge in a material way. It's not just about ideas, it's about struggle over production, control of production, land, labor, other kinds of resources. And that is part of what drives forward these transitions in history. Very roughly speaking, Marxism speaks of a mode of production as an overarching way that society is arranged at any given point. And the roughest of distinctions that Marxism offers is that after the breakup of collective society, traditional society, the next historical phase is slave society, not modern slavery that we'll be talking more about, but more thousands of years ago, sort of a sort of quasi-ancient form of slavery, that over time slavery gives way to and is overthrown by the consolidation of power into feudal orders, which are determined by a sort of semi-free form of labor. You've got the feudal lord on the one hand and the serf on the other that is bound to their land, bound to work for them, It's not slavery, but it's not free exactly, either. And this is what is primarily sort of present in Europe up to the moment of the French Revolution, the English Revolution, right? You've got the monarchies, the aristocracy. This is not a strictly speaking capitalist society until the transition from feudalism to capitalism, after which point these old structures of privilege are broken down. The monarchies are mostly abolished. If they, they may retain a symbolic weight, but they're mostly abolished because capitalism has to be in the driver's seat. How does Marxism understand the transition between these phases? Through revolutions, right? Through violent moments of, the outbreak of struggle for political control. And in particular, the way this is characterized in the transition from feudalism to capitalism is that the bourgeoisie is engaging in some small-scale capitalism. It's gaining some wealth. It's getting rich in the cities in particular. And at a certain point, the young bourgeoisie is very wealthy and has no political power, right? Why? Because the political power is monopolized by the monarchy and the aristocracy and all these old sort of noble titles that don't mean anything when it comes to this question of accumulating wealth, right? And the French Revolution is often understood as one of those breaking points where you move from feudalism to capitalism because the bourgeoisie say, listen, we're rich, we want power. They overthrow the monarchy. In this case, they kill a bunch of people, and then they take power and recreate society in a capitalist form, right? By changing the laws, by incorporating the protection of private property, making it easier to accumulate wealth, all of these things, right? Making it harder for traditions of any kind, as Marx puts it, to have any bearing, right? All that is solid melts into air. All old rules disappear. Capitalism becomes the reigning force. Maybe unnecessarily sort of detailed trajectory, but this is roughly where the French Revolution is often understood to be located, right? It is the moment of transition from feudalism to capitalism based on internal tensions and internal contradictions, meaning the bourgeoisie is gaining wealth, getting too powerful, and chooses to then overthrow the old feudal order and create a new system, right? What do we see present in this? We see that this trajectory and this historical view is based on European history. It's based on, again, observation, right? It's based on the same kind of inductive analysis that we were talking about, but it's just that Marx is looking at European history. The question then is, what do you do with that observation of European history? Do you make it into the entirety of history? Or do you understand that it's a particular location in a broader history, right? It assumes a linear movement because it looks at that European history and says, Europe passed through these stages, therefore everyone probably will have to pass through these stages to reach capitalism, and then for Marxism to get beyond capitalism to future communism, right? It's often economically deterministic, meaning that the tensions that drive it are built into the economy at the expense of other questions of sort of ideas, concepts, less tangible sort of material pieces. It often presumes the nation state to be the unit of analysis, and this is really getting to the point, right? As we already said, internal contradictions within France are seen as generating the French Revolution. Class conflict, the emergence of a new bourgeoisie, it gains power. Those are understood within the nation state, and often you see these kind of trajectories understood to be the future trajectory of any nation state on a global scale. This all becomes very problematic for third world Marxists who don't see any of this happening in their context. And again, revolutionary change is seen to come from within. James is not going to see things moving in this way, right? When he sets about his materialist analysis, in other words, when he looks at the class structure in San Domingo in a Marxist way, which is to say, listen, I believe history moves through class conflict. What are the classes, right? He doesn't say modern society is determined by the opposition between proletarians and bourgeoisie. Let's apply that onto Haiti. He says, let's look at the classes, let's see what there is, let's map them out, and begin from there when we begin to understand telling the history, as it emerges. So whether he knows it consciously or just intuitively, in his own words, he's going to be doing the same thing that Du Bois is doing when he talks about mapping out these class structures. That's what he's doing when he begins with the property, the owners, when he begins to dismantle and disentangle all of the internal contradictions that exist in those classes in the chapters that are going to be coming over the next few weeks. That's already a lot. Now let's look at the book a little bit. If we look at the first preface to the first edition, we see some interesting pieces already. First edition being 1938. The question of revolution emerges very quickly. This is at the bottom of Roman numeral 10. In a revolution, when the ceaseless, slow accumulation of centuries bursts into volcanic eruption, the meteoric flares and flights above are a meaningless chaos and lend themselves to infinite caprice and romanticism, unless the observer sees them always as projections of the subsoil from which they came. Revolution is a volcano. There's something interesting here that I'll probably come back to, which is that, and in this book called Anti-Colonial Eruptions, I write a lot about the fact that anti-colonial and slave rebellions are almost always described as volcanoes, right? And that's partly because those observing them and those shocked by them are admitting that they were shocked. Like, we didn't see what was happening below the surface. We just saw it when it exploded, right? We were surprised. We'll come back to that in a couple of chapters for sure. Here, he's using that volcanic metaphor to do something which is both a little Marxist and a little not, right? It's very Marxist in the sense that what he's saying is, listen, the base is what matters. What's going on and the structural dynamics are what matters. We don't want to miss, the forest for the trees. We don't want to pay too much attention to the small details or to the role of certain individuals or certain moments. We want to track and understand, as revolutionary analysts need to do, what's going on below the surface. That's what's fundamental, right? And we see also this incredibly crucial statement that we mentioned last time. This is up toward the top of Roman numeral 10, when James is writing of Toussaint. And he speaks to this question of the role of the individual. Again, he says, we don't want to mistake the meteoric flares for the revolution, and individuals are meteoric flares in that sense. He says, yet Toussaint did not make the revolution. It was the revolution that made Toussaint. And even that is not the whole truth. Even that is not the whole truth. In these revolutionary explosions, the role of the individual is going to be something incredibly complicated to map out. This is something he's struggling with. Again, he begins this book thinking he's going to write about Toussaint. He, in the process of the book, is writing less and less. He's writing more and more about what he's calling here this question of the personification of social forces. The fact that individuals are playing roles that are given to them, presented to them by historical moments. Those moments are created at the sort of, what's it called? The grinding of the tectonic plates of this subterranean content. And the difficulty is when and how to determine, as he puts it, those rare moments when society is at a boiling point and therefore fluid. Again, this is 1938, and he's writing very consciously to that. Toward the end of this very first preface, he says, he's talking about the process of writing. It was in the stillness of a seaside suburb that could be heard most clearly and insistently the booming of Franco's heavy artillery, the rattle of Stalin's firing squads, and the fierce, shrill turmoil of the revolutionary movement striving for clarity and influence, such as our age in this book is of it, with something of the fever and the fret. This book is the history of a revolution, and written under different circumstances, it would have been a different, but not necessarily a better book. The question of the individual is the question also of him as the author, right? And it's funny that he says it would have been a different book, but not necessarily better, because then in 1971, he was like, listen, you know what? I could write it better now. He gives a whole lecture called How I Would Write the Black Jacobins Today. And if we recall, something that we mentioned last week, the main takeaway of that is it would have been written from the perspective of the grassroots. it would have less of the piece on leadership or more of a dialectical understanding of the leadership, but that's already present in here as well. Do people have any questions? Maybe we should take a couple questions before we dig right into the first prologues.
Yeah, I was wondering if you know much about C.L.R. James's religious background and if that was impacting his writing at all. Just curious.
The question is on C.L.R. James' religious background, whether it impacts his writing. Not in a conscious way, right? The way that he would narrate it, and again, this is not even fully conscious, is actually, it's got more to do with the way that his parents' religion led to him being brutalized in certain ways, right? And that made him the kind of person that he was for all of the good and the bad. So maybe less when it comes to this piece of his grasp of what a revolution is, but certainly when it comes to who he is, his character, the reason that he takes the sort of the leaps that he takes in life, the fact that from a very young age he sat in his house and read all day long, right? And what he understood that to mean. The way that, for example, he transitions very quickly from one form of recognition, which is this piece about writing a great novel and being a great Trinidadian writer, to then suddenly converting to Marxism, but with the full force of like a new disciple, right? He becomes fully Marxist. That's all he wants to talk about. All he wants to build is this revolution that gets associated with Trotsky and Trotskyism. So you can see it playing out, I think, in a lot of ways, but it's not like infusing his political understanding, and he's very much on the surface of it a secular, very secular kind of thinker, for sure. It's not a sort of religious revolutionary in any sense. There's something, though, about third world revolutionary Marxism, though. I always say this, right? Because if we think about this economically deterministic piece, and people may have heard me say this, they may be getting bored with it, but the reality is third world Marxism is much less mechanical. It's much less heavily materialist at the expense of ideas and idealist elements, and it's much more open to the way that idealism can be a spiritualism, right? So Mariátegui, for example, in Peru, will say we need to spiritualize Marxism. We need great heroic acts of sacrifice that will build this Marxist future. Right? That's very peculiarly non-European, right, for the way that a Marxist understands. You got, of course, you've got revolutionary priests like Camilo Torres in Colombia, like picking up the gun. You've got, the ways in which these mix together. And that's no accident. It comes very much from the fact that this economic determinism comes from a very strict understanding of how class oppositions work, where you've got the proletariat, you've got the bourgeoisie. They're these two powerful forces in an industrial society fighting against each other. And capitalism is wiping away the traces of religion, right? There's this idea in traditional Marxism that primitive, collective, traditional society was destroyed. That's not true, right? One of the first things that Walter Rodney does when he analyzes Africa is say, listen, most of Africa is still collective. The assumption that the past is the past is very, overstated in Europe and non-existent on a global level, right? And there's a relationship between that and how that then becomes a politics, if that makes sense, that opens itself to spirituality and different forms of the sort of balancing of the opposition between ideas and material reality, if that makes sense. I fear it didn't make perfect sense, but there's a lot to be said. This one over here. Oh, this one.
Kind of related to that question, and just speaking as someone who doesn't know enough about James and what he then wants to revisit in terms of grassroots organizing versus leadership, I feel like one of the things that I kind of came in at least knowing from some loved ones was the role that spiritual practices and voodoo and women priestesses held in igniting this revolution actually. So I'm just really curious about in his life's work if he kind of
Yeah.
visits that or revisits that later on.
That will be crucial, right? That's going to be central. There's a couple things we could add to it to say, I mean, it's not something that James incorporates as part of his own understanding of the world. He understands its importance, he reads its importance, and he reads it in ways, this is very similar to Du Bois in the context of the US Civil War, right? That both understands it as spirituality from a distance, right? They're both very rational, very, Western trained thinkers, but also feel like, understand what the feeling of that means, right? If that makes sense. Du Bois probably better than James, getting into that feeling, getting into that psychological piece as he himself recognized. But both also would say that they don't want to limit these questions to, it's not just religion, right? The point is to understand that religion is a mode of communication and organizing, right? That's what voodoo meant in this context. It meant many other things. It's an entire cosmology, but the cosmology gives rise to the kind of confidence that says this revolution is possible, right? The kind of confidence that says from the very beginning, and he's sort of reciting and reproducing this song / chant that says like we pledge ourselves to eliminate the whites, right? To reclaim society, right? In a certain kind of sense. You find that also in many different forms of religions, like a sort of Incan religions that speak of a Pachacutic, an inversion of the world, after which the colonizers will be wiped from the face of the earth, and there's a new sort of reign that emerges. So you've got this religious content, and it's also very much about mobilizing. I never want to say, like we take this thing of like a respect for religion qua spirituality, and we reduce it to being a far smaller scope than what it actually is in practice, if that makes sense. Again, I'm not sure if that was clear. I think we have one more question over here, right? Yeah.
This is just a clarifying question. When you were talking about the volcano reference that he makes here, I thought I heard you say like it's a common thing that other third world Marxists reference, but then I thought in the beginning you said like something about the statement was both Marxist and not Marxist. So I was wondering if you could say more about the part that was not Marxist. Or maybe I misunderstood.
No, you understood it perfectly.
Okay.
But you're pressing me on something that, I'll see if I can answer for you. What's very Marxist about that statement, and I'll say something similar about stuff he says at the end of the first chapter as well. What's very Marxist about the statement is this idea of pressures building up, if that makes sense, right? Again, this Marxist idea of revolution is like these pressures are building up within feudal society, and they reach a point where, in the Marxist language, that society and its structures become fetters to development, or fetters to the expansion of the productive forces, or just fetters to the people who are fighting against it, right? At a certain point, the pressures build up and they explode into a revolution, right? So there's this hydraulic piece that happens in Marxism that you see in the volcano metaphor. I think I don't know, maybe you could read it as a very sort of straightforwardly orthodox sort of Marxist line, but I guess I see something a little more into it in terms of the subterranean. Maybe that's, again, me reading the anti-colonial trajectory into it, the subterranean piece that's less visible, less apparent to the eye. He's saying you should be able to see it, but if that's the case, then so many Marxists don't, right? And don't, grasp it because they're not doing the kind of analysis that needs to be done. Again, maybe that's not clear. I think it'll become a little clearer because we'll see the way that he sees the pressures building up. The way he's reading the pressures is a little different, if that makes sense. Cool. We can look at the prologue. We're getting toward the first chapter. We'll get through the first chapter, I swear. Again, the prologue is very brief. It begins, very interestingly, with Columbus. It begins with God and with gold, which is to say, and this is worth emphasizing, it begins with a broad colonial frame, right? This is 1492, it's not 1619 or some other date, right? Why? Because this is Hispaniola, right? Like this is the center of the emerging Spanish sort of conquest. For Haiti, in other words, the story begins here when it comes to the colonial conquest, and it's not separable from it, right? again, we've said before, James would not tolerate this idea that we have of abolition or something being a US-based phenomenon or just about the way that US-based slavery has led to us. No, none of that, right? These are transnational phenomena, right? Transnational because they were looking for God, and they landed in the name of God, and they were looking for gold. They inquired urgently for gold. Now, we raised in the context of the appendix the troubling question of civilization, where James speaks of plantation agriculture as both demoralizing and civilizing. And we were like, how the fuck could it be civilizing? What is civilizing about plantation agriculture? And on page 4, at least, the sarcasm is pretty obvious. They introduced Christianity, forced labor in mines, murder, rape, bloodhounds, strange diseases, and artificial famine. These and other requirements of the higher civilization reduced the native population from an estimated 500,000 to 60,000, right? Civilization there, of course, is incredibly sarcastic. And, this foregrounds lots of ways that different anti-colonial thinkers, Césaire in particular, will flip the question of civilization, say, you claim to be civilized and you're doing the opposite. James is towing that line for sure. He then tells us a very important piece of this story when it comes to the conquest, when he mentions the very famous friar Bartolomé de las Casas, who's correctly remembered, as a great defender of the indigenous people, right? He defends indigenous people in these debates in Spain and Valladolid in 1550 and 1551, the ultimate conclusion of which is to declare indigenous people in the Americas human, right? Now, that's a mixed bag because it means you can be forcibly converted to Catholicism, but they're declared human, right? What's less remembered is how these debates, first of all, didn't really change conditions on the ground for most indigenous people. Right? It maybe created a legal transition, but the de facto reality was that people were still being genocided, of course. But the key part that James is bringing up is the way that these debates were also a hinge and a pivot from indigenous slavery to African slavery, right? Because part of what De las Casas and others say is, well, indigenous people are human, they need to be treated as human, but we still need labor. And we can find that in these very good laborers that are being brought from Africa. So, again, this is an important pivot, but it's through these pivots that we understand the transnational story of colonialism, right? It's not that, again, as James would say very clearly from the beginning, it's not that anti-Black racism is the global frame as like an Afro-pessimist argument would have it. It's that these are emerging in the context of colonial domination. First directed against indigenous people, and then through this strange pivot, turned onto African slaves, right? And turned onto them with a vengeance. This is why James cryptically writes that, quote, priest and king launched transatlantic slavery as what he calls a compromise. And it's a compromise because of these kinds of debates. Now, how do we get, it's very, interesting question that then emerges. How do we get from gold? They said they're here looking for gold. How do we get from that to labor? Because there's really not that much gold, right? And this pivot tells us a lot about Haiti, but it also tells us a lot about the broader unevenness of colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. Because those regions that had precious metals saw very different development paths geared toward extraction. We can think of the silver mines in Potosi as the sort of classic example. There's so much silver that the degree of extraction to the point of the genocidal destruction of the laborers in doing that extraction is so powerful, right? The goal of colonialism, where there are natural resources, to extract those resources, right? Whereas those without turn toward the process of cultivation through labor in different forms. And in the long run, this explains lasting demographic, social, and political differences. For example, Brazil, as we know it, is the product of two very interesting confusions or accidents of history. The first being that these Portuguese explorers are blown off course and land in Brazil. And they're like, where are we? The second being that when they get there, the lack of natural resources leads to Brazil being, alongside Haiti, one of the first places that plantation agriculture is developed, right? It's the absence of natural resources that leads to plantation agriculture. because you have to find a different way to extract profit, less directly from the land and more directly from the labor that's being employed in that cultivation. There are other accidents of history. For example, this is like Eduardo Galeano, for people who know, the great sort of Latin American historian. He has this story about that's part of why the US ends up able to take a different path. First, because of the way that British influence is introduced, but also because there's very few natural resources. Immediately it has to become a process of cultivation under very different forms, right? And he says that the United States was very lucky to not have natural resources, right? Or it would have been subject to very different dynamics. And needless to say, these accidents then produce long-term demographic pieces, right? The fact that Brazil today is a largely and heavily Afro-Brazilian, huge Afro-Brazilian population, the fact that there were massive Maroon quilombos in the backcountry of Brazil, all of these are products of these accidents. So it's very, very interesting. And one key accident leads to the West Indies being agriculturally grounded in plantation production. Okay, chapter 1. The property. We've talked about the framing, we've talked about what it means. And in this chapter, it was very interesting to me that James begins with, in a way, the question that Du Bois had ended with. If people remember the last chapter of Black Reconstruction, chapter 17 is called The Propaganda of History. When we read it first because we want to think about the framing again, that the context that Du Bois is writing in. And James writes here at the very beginning of the book on page 7, ours too is an age of propaganda. Fundamentally, the propaganda that he's talking about here is the propaganda of the happy slave, the propaganda of the kind slave master, what would be called in the US context at least, the patriarchal myth of slavery. This is built upon a propaganda of liberating Africans from themselves, right? Life would have been much worse. You're very, lucky to have been brought to a more civilized context. And this then underpins so many other colonial myths, which are that colonialism brought civilization and that colonized people didn't want or were not capable of self-determination or self-government. Again, recall, that is James' fundamental goal. He's drawn to the Haitian Revolution because he says, oh, this is a moment where we see this is possible. A slave revolution that creates a new society, right? It is the living proof, right, or the disproof of this myth. They say it's impossible, it was already done, right? So this is why James turns to this. So he begins with his propaganda, and one of his fundamental goals is to disprove it. The propaganda, as he puts it, exists to, quote, foster national pride or to soothe a troubled conscience. And people believe what he calls the professional whitewashers because they want to. It assuages their sort of guilt, right? There's sort of this cognitive dissonance of all slave societies. This is very much the same thing that Du Bois is saying in Black Reconstruction, right? He's saying this is why propaganda is developed. This is why it exists. And Du Bois confronts a very similar myth, right? Which is he's writing in a context where he's pushing back on an entire school of historiography called the Dunning School. Foundational assumption of that school, which dominated Yale, Harvard into the 20th century, was that there was not that much resistance to slavery. There weren't that many slave insurrections in the US. People didn't really fight back because they were actually kind of cool with it. They were being treated pretty well. It took a whole wave of historians, including mostly communists like Herbert Aptheker, to write a history of slave revolts, right? To say, no, this was happening the whole time, right? And that's in many ways where James is going to begin as well. Despite the claims of civilizing colonial propaganda, he writes that Central Africa was peaceful. And here we find a peculiar statement that's worth just sticking with for a second. Quote, it was on a peasantry in many respects superior to the serfs of large areas of Europe that the slave trade fell. Superior to the serfs of Europe. In other words, Africa was positioned in a way already that disrupts the historical progress and the myths of European superiority. But it's also an indictment of European intervention, right? Which is to say that the violence that emerged was caused and not cured by the colonial intervention. Resistance was immediate, as James documents, right? Contrary, this is a quote, contrary to the lies that have been spread so pertinaciously about Negro docility, the revolts at the ports of embarkation and on board were incessant. Constant revolts, constant resistance. People, of course, did not want to be enslaved. Enslaved Africans were treated as commodities, of course, as property. This is the clear truth of his chapter title, but the consequences are also clear. They could be destroyed. If there was more profit to be made by dumping them overboard, they would be dumped overboard, or they would be left rotting in filth and sickness that, quote, turned these holds into a hell. There were hunger strikes. There were insurrections. There's a long tradition of suicide, not as a desperate act, but as an act of taking control of one's body, not being property, right? Destroying the property form that you're being forced into, right? In the process of reclaiming your own body in death. Again, unlike Du Bois, he is trying to prove that enslaved people were human. I mean, he doesn't think any differently, but he still thinks it's worth trying to prove and trying to demonstrate. At the bottom of page 11, he says, the difficulty was that though one could trap them like animals, transport them in pens, work them alongside an ass or a horse and beat both with the same stick, stable them and starve them, they remained, despite their black skins and curly hair, quite invincibly human beings. Quite invincibly human beings, right? This stubborn humanity, in conjunction with the demands of the sugar plantation, meant that, again, contrary to this propaganda, docility was not a given, because resistance would be the sort of natural reaction. And what was necessary was what James calls a regime of calculated brutality and terrorism. He details this torture, not just to rehearse the violent details, but also to disprove the propaganda and to drive home the reality of a kind of dialectical relationship between inhumanity and humanity. Not only are enslaved people human and act like humans, but the point was to break that humanity, right? To render them animals. Also, though, for James, it's to satisfy this kind of lustful resentment of the owners as well, right? There's a real kind of Freudian violence built into how he understands the slave masters too, that you see in, of course, those tortures that go well beyond the needs of production, that go well beyond the symbolic reproduction of the system. He talks about burning people with wax, boiling them with sugar, cooking them alive, blowing them up with gunpowder, letting insects devour them. He talks as well about the way that women are tortured in very specific ways. He refers toward the end of the chapter of this case of Lejeune. It's sort of a side note, but it's very important for James because it's 100 years after after what's called the Negro Code, which was a set of regulations saying, no, you have to treat people at least, on this minimum sort of like at this minimum level, right? And what James is showing is that there's such a fundamental gap between what the law says in France and what's actually happening in the colonies. That gap is going to be incredibly important for the way the dynamics play out. But part of what's counterintuitive and is worth emphasizing is that, and this is true in a lot of Latin America, is that the whites in the colonies were much, much worse, actually. And they were worse for a reason, right? They were the ones who understood the system in its full reality. They were the ones who weren't hiding behind sort of myths and propaganda quite as much. They saw it face to face, and their lives depended on it, right? This, again, true in Latin America, true in, if we're thinking of like the Pieds Noirs in North Africa, the French colonists in Algeria, right? These were the most fascistic defenders of French colonialism because they had the most to lose in a certain sense. It was their life and their way of life, and they couldn't see an alternative to it, right? As James has already said, it was their all, right? They resisted not only through suicide, but also through feigned stupidity. And here, like, if people know of like James Scott's theory of the hidden transcript, right? You've got the face that's put on toward the master and the hidden sort of transcript that happens behind the scenes. This is very much what James is showing. This playing dumb, acting like you don't understand what's happening, when in reality, there's this suspicion by the masters that they write about all the time that enslaved people are actually deceiving them, right? They're much smarter than they're acting. And there's something that is escaping their control. They also resisted through what James calls a homicidal mania. Mass poisoning was a key method that he brings up. It's directed not toward the broader community, but specifically toward, by women toward children, right? By sort of wet nurses, midwives, black midwives who were suspected of, killing, by the scores, white children in the cradle. And it's really important to understand the ways that both fire and poison were historically methods of enslaved women in particular, right? In part because of the kind of subterfuge that was required, but in part because of the access, right? Enslaved women were asked to do work in domestic spaces that gave them certain kinds of access to either burning down the master's house or deploying poison into their food. All of these pieces, it's worth mentioning, and James really emphasizes, become part of white supremacist ideology. They just cycle like if people resist, it's then you're being violent, right? If people play dumb, it's like, well, you're either stupid or, you're being devious, right? And you're not being honest about what you know. But, the question is not so much how this becomes a white supremacist sort of myth, but James says this very interesting thing. He says, he said enslaved people were incredibly intelligent, but you don't need to be intelligent to want freedom. If resistance was constant, it wasn't even. And here James begins to break down and complicate the singularity of this property, right? Or the singularity of the black population. And those are different populations, right? There are free black people, and those, are distinctions that are going to be important, right? In the next few chapters, this is what he's going to do more broadly. He's going to just proliferate these different classes and different class distinctions, and even where there's something that he would call a class, he shows all the tensions internal to them, right? Which are dialectical tensions insofar as they become motion, right? Internally, he makes a very brief observation that we need to keep in mind, and this is going to be hugely important, right? He says that African-born slaves were more intransigent and more resistant than locally born Creoles, right? Creole is the term for born in the colony, right? Whether it's the whites or enslaved people, right? He says African-born slaves are far more radical and intransigent than those born in the colony. This makes perfect sense, right? If you've been captured from a condition of freedom, you know it personally, you have a very direct memory of it. And a concept of what it would mean to be once again free, right? So this makes sense. And there's a term for African-born slaves that James doesn't use here, but which becomes very important in the literature on Haiti, which is bozales. I don't know if people know the term. And bozale comes from the Spanish word for a muzzle that's put on enslaved people who are too resistant, right? And these bozales, or African-born, sometimes enslaved, sometimes very, very free people, this category comes to describe not only individuals who are born in Africa, but also an entire level of community organization, and political outlook, which will become crucial. The very different worldview that they often held. This is something that James does not fully describe, right? But which more recent literature has drawn out. And to sort of maybe give a bit of a spoiler, the bozales want something very, very different from what the leadership of the Haitian Revolution wants, right? They're more radical, they're more communal, they're more sort of in the vein of Maroon communities and Maroon oriented. Page 19. James says there was also what he calls a small privileged caste that was attached to and loyal to their masters, that participated in, justified, and legitimized the propaganda, right? They were part of it. They played along with it up to a certain point. James goes so far as to describe, and this is kind of in the middle of page 19, and the sort of the back and forth, it's like you get vertigo from the back and forth he does right here, right? But first he describes this privileged caste of enslaved people as, what does he say exactly? As trained monkeys, He says they're so integrated into the system of power, they regurgitate it, they're like trained monkeys. But then he adds the surprising but crucial bit, which is that some use their privilege to educate themselves and then, quote, this is in the middle of page 19, the leaders of a revolution are usually those who have been able to profit by the cultural advantages of the system they are attacking. And the San Domingo Revolution was no exception to this rule. In other words, while he's disparaging this group of relatively privileged enslaved people, he's talking about Toussaint. He's talking about other leaders who come from a position of relative privilege within the institution of slavery. There's something very, very important. He's already laying out these kind of dynamics and even what he calls rules of revolution, right? Rules of the way that these things unfold. One we already saw earlier, we'll talk about more, is it's not always the most radical people that start the revolution. And here he's talking on the side of the resistance. It's not always the most oppressed who are leading a revolution. But as we will see, there are incredibly complicated consequences of this. Finally, the boldest, as he puts it, are the Maroons themselves. Those who flee, those who were never fully, subject to the system of slavery, those who establish by the thousands their own communities, right? Who return to either known systems of governance and self-governments and communal life that are known to themselves or that are passed down through the generations or that are developed in conjunction with indigenous people on the island, right? We're talking about those communities that escape and develop their own form of life. Within the sort of characterizations of marronage or the process of marooning, there's sort of what's referred to as petit marronage, like small marronage, which is individual escape, right? But here we're talking about what's often referred to as ground marronage, right? The large creation of community, right? And alternatives. And then finally, there's a very important piece to add to this because often the goal was simply to escape and live a sort of autonomous and collective existence, right, in community. But for others, either by desire or by necessity, the goal was to develop and cultivate a fighting force that would be powerful enough to go overthrow the system, right? Destroy the slave structure, expel the whites entirely. And of course, Mackandal was one very powerful example of a Maroon leader who sought to do just that. He was fearless, he was one-handed, he was a powerful orator, and he was caught plotting to systematically poison all of the wells in the white community at once in the mid-1700s. Doesn't sound like a terrible idea. Page 24. So the colonists, the whites who are so invested in this system, would fight tooth and nail to preserve it. As we'll see very clearly, they will fight tooth and nail to prevent any reform to it, any change, even the tiniest possibility of liberation for even the smallest sector of the community of color. And James writes here, kind of echoing the way he frames things in the appendix on the Caribbean and the West Indies, he says, this was the problem to be solved. This is on page 24. This was the problem to be solved. Hope from the planters, there was none. In France, he talks about liberalism, he talks about Diderot and the encyclopedists who attack slavery, but in words only. He says, such outbursts neither then nor now, it's writing in the 1930s, neither then nor now carry weight. Any wordy attacks on slavery drew sneers from observers, which were not altogether undeserved. The authors were compared to doctors who offered to a patient nothing more than invectives against the disease which consumed him, right? A doctor offering you words instead of treatment. Wordy responses were not enough to solve this problem. But there's an exception. It's not really an exception. He speaks of the great priest Abbé Raynal, who is a writer who writes the philosophical and political history of the establishments and commerce of the Europeans in the two Indies. Very long title for something that's much, much more interesting, because Raynal is, among other things, calling for a slave revolution. Right? This is different than just words, right? Sometimes words are more than just words. Abbé Raynal is writing this, and CLR James describes a kind of imagined scenario in which Toussaint is reading Raynal's famous book, in which he says, in what he reads, right? Quote, "A courageous chief only is wanted." Where is he? In other words, who will lead this mass of slaves in a massive revolution? But again, the whiplash is kind of severe. Over and over again, Toussaint read this passage, "A courageous chief only is wanted." Where is he? A courageous chief was wanted. It is the tragedy of mass movements that they need and can only too rarely find adequate leadership. A courageous chief is wanted. But much else was wanted. This is James switching gears very dramatically. If you're looking at the text at the bottom of page 25, and he returns to something he had said in a different way in the prologue. Men make their own history, and the Black Jacobins of San Domingo were to make history which would alter the fate of millions of men and shift the economic currents of 3 continents. 3 continents. But if they could seize opportunity, they could not create it. If they could seize opportunity, they could not create it. The conditions were not of their own creation, according to James. Seizing is different from creating. And here, as elsewhere, James is really, he's echoing, when he talks about people creating history but not under conditions of their own choosing, he's echoing Marx very famously in the 18th Brumaire. That's the Marx analyzing the unfolding of dynamic events in process in a way that gets him a lot closer to someone like James, right? It's not the Marx systematically analyzing capitalism, very different Marx. And so it sounds very, very similar. More was necessary beyond just leadership. The situation and the circumstances had to allow that leadership to matter. They had to create a breach or an opening into which that leadership could step, or into which the people, the masses themselves, could step collectively. And as James puts it, this is the very next line, "The slave trade and slavery were woven tight into the economics of the 18th century. They're right at the heart of it." Now, is that create or discourage opportunity is going to be the question. 3 forces, the proprietors of San Domingo, the French bourgeoisie, and the British bourgeoisie throve on this devastation of a continent and on the brutal exploitation of millions. 3 forces. As long as these maintained an equilibrium, the infernal traffic would go on, and for that matter would have gone on till the present day. But nothing, however profitable, goes on forever. From the very momentum of their own development, colonial planters, French and British bourgeois, were generating internal stresses and intensifying external rivalries, moving blindly to explosions and conflicts, which would shatter the basis of their dominance and create the possibility of emancipation. That's the end of the chapter, right? There's so much going on here, both, again, with Marx and beyond, right? On the one hand, with Marxism, there's the idea that internal tensions are building up, right? And especially grounded in economic basis. We're going to see that, as with Marx and the understanding of the transition, both to capitalism and then beyond it, the question is this accumulation of profit, right? This is one of the pressures that's developing, right? So there's an internal economic momentum that's creating contradictions that create transformation, and how these contradictions emerge as well within capitalism, right? He's pointing to these sort of intra-imperial rivalries. That's all among capitalists, right? And one of the main things that Marx shows is it's not just a single capitalist brain out there strategizing how best to stay in power. Capitalism is internally contradictory because there are capitalists struggling between and against each other. There are nations of capitalists struggling between and against each other over these resources that they need, right? And the struggles create explosive possibilities. So that's, in a certain degree, alongside Marxism. But if we look back at the historical trajectory, right, and the chart of historical development, it gets more complicated, in part because it's transnational and is geopolitical, right? Less a classic story of a bourgeois revolution that emerges from within the tensions generated within French society, right? Feudalism creating tensions, contradictions, the French bourgeoisie gaining accumulating wealth, and then using that to seize the French government. This story is starting somewhere else. And we're going to see that and the depths and the degrees to which the story of the French Revolution is based on the foundation that is Haiti next week. And this is all to say the main difference between this story that he's telling and the classic Marxist story is the question of where are the slaves, where are the property, what role did they play, right? And what's very interesting here, we're not fully into it yet, but what's very interesting here is that he's talking about the abolition of slavery. We know that's part of what he's talking about. He's talking about the slaves. He's talking about the need for a great leader, the need for an opportunity to seize. But then he switches to these three forces at the very, very top of society, right? None of these three forces wants emancipation, but all of them will play a role in making it possible, right? Their clash between them creates the possibility, this is the last line, create the possibility of emancipation, the breaking down of this consensus. So things are going to get much, much more complicated as this story goes on. This is literally just the fucking beginning, right? You've seen like one sector of Haitian society that's fragmented in a couple of ways. Every piece is going to be fragmented, and it's going to be transnational, and they're going to be bouncing off each other and rebounding like pinballs. And we're going to need to pay close attention to the property, which is far from just that, the many actors who have yet to enter the picture, and also the fragmentation that allows them to do such. Much more was wanted. They needed a chance. They needed an opportunity. This clash among those vying for more power, or what's often referred to in revolutionary kind of literature as an elite schism, right? A fragmentation at the top of society of those in power creates the possibility and space for others to make a claim for power. This will play out in France, and it will play out in the transnational and Haitian context, creating an opening for more radical sectors in both societies to enter history. That's the motion that James is going to be documenting. Do people have questions on that? Shit is going to get so complicated. Just you wait. I demand questions.
All right. So we have a question based on page 18. There's a footnote at the bottom of page 18 that says, such observations written in 1938 were intended to use the San Domingo Revolution as a forecast of the future of colonial Africa. And the question is, did James ever discuss this footnote or this idea later on in the century?
So for folks that are seeing, it's footnote 12 here. And it's a reference to something we brought up, right? This idea that James wrote this book for Africa, and this is him sort of restating that. And he's saying it very clearly here, right? He's referencing the fact that, as he puts it, for 200 years the slaves sang at their meetings as the Jews in Babylon sang of Zion, and the Bantus today sing in secret the national anthem of Africa. I think he's just making that clear, right? We know that, and we've rehearsed the fact that this book was written for Africa because he said it in lectures in 1971, right? But he doesn't write it very clearly in the preface to the preface to the first edition, the prologue. He doesn't write it very clearly in any of these pieces, right? So this is one of the very brief moments where he's pointing to it. And it's interesting that he points that out because he's going to do a lot of very specific reference points. You'll be reading something about like the dynamics of the Haitian Revolution, and then suddenly he'll be like, it's like Stalin and Trotsky and this, and you're like, well, where did that come from? And it's because he's very clearly writing it for 1938, and he's thinking about 1938. He's actually thinking past 1938. But here he's just trying to, I think, flag that a little bit, to really drive home the fact that he's thinking not necessarily of Haiti, but he's thinking of Africa, that he's thinking of the sort of African Revolution, so that people don't think that it's too strange that he's speaking so far out of context. But again, that's the piece. And the central core of that is that Haiti provides an example of what can and must be done, right? And what is possible. something that, again, James himself is discovering and realizing, having only come into contact with Africans a few years before this, having himself going through a kind of awakening about what's going on in Africa, right? Meeting in an apartment in London with all of these future African leaders and heads of state, and they're just hanging out and they're talking about it and they're conspiring and they're thinking about what's possible and they're all learning, right? Again, he said that when they read his book, they were astonished at what had happened in Haiti. Paul Robeson read it in London and was astonished at what had happened in Haiti because they were all learning as well. What else?
So you say it's going to get more complicated.
Yes,
I
it will
100% believe you.
get more
When it comes to reading, because there is kind of this whiplash effect of like the tone of voice shifting, do you have any additional tips for reading as we go on?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, and I said a little bit last week, but it's not, I don't know how useful it is. It's really just like pay attention to the shifts as much as you can. And again, just on a structural level, these first few chapters will be a little easier. There will be complicated things that begin to happen in terms of the story he's trying to tell, but it'll be they're much shorter, and it'll be a lot clearer when he transitions into kind of structural explanation, right? Or, you know, and again, speaking of what we just mentioned, if he says something about his contemporary sort of world, or the 1930s, or fascism, or something like that, or this is how all revolutions, you know, like progress, right? These are things obviously to pay attention to. And just work on that skill, right? Of trying to filter through some of the names, trying to filter through some of the history. Go to Wikipedia if you have to follow some of the basic elements, right? I'll try to, again, each week, lay out some of the basic events that are happening, because it gets a little complicated on the French side as well. And try to keep track of what's most important. The last chapter is going to be, in many ways, one of the longest and hardest. And he wrote this very quickly. So, I mean, to his credit, he was writing this very, very quickly, putting all these notes together quickly, and it comes out pretty coherently. But you get to the last chapter, and you're like, why is this chapter like 3 times as long as all the other chapters? Is there something I'm missing? But yeah, it's not easy, but we got to do it. Same thing with Black Reconstruction. When you're giving this sort of historical account, right? You are both trying to explain it, and you're trying to say what happened. And for you to explain the dynamism of it, what happened and what is happening, and how to explain it, are things that are also shifting and in motion, right? That's the sort of quote that we mentioned last time, where he says, you can't write a balanced account of a revolution, because a revolution throws everything out of balance, right? The people become different people, the categories become different categories, right? And so trying to keep all of that moving is the skill that he has, which is part of what makes it so confusing. Yeah. What else?
Okay. So we have, okay, I found it. The next question that we have is how/why were Maroon communities allowed to grow and develop rather than being crushed by colonial powers? Or were they continually crushed and just kept reemerging?
Yeah. They weren't allowed, right? Maroon communities didn't, they weren't allowed. They were impossible to defeat, right? Again, this is a sort of permanent feature of history, which is that wherever repression is failing or incapable of imposing its will, different alternatives emerge, and they take collective form, and they look very similar across history, right? Which is that people want to live together collectively and share their goods and live in peace and live in harmony, and they don't want to be enslaved, right? So anytime people escape, they flee. We're talking about mountainous regions. We're talking about, and again, this is more specific, but it's one of those things that you can track, right? Where there are mountains, these communities do better, right? Where there are mountains, indigenous communities survive longer and are more difficult to sort of stamp out. And so you've got these spaces where it's literally impossible for them to completely destroy all forms of resistance, right? And we'll talk more about the demographics next time, but just to give a bit of a sort of, like a hint as to why it's impossible. This is a society in which 5% of the population is white, right? Less than 10%, right? In which 90% are enslaved, right? There's no way that you can police that society. There's no way that you can fully impose that power, especially from a distance of many thousands of miles, right? So what we see and what becomes very crucial for the playing out of the dynamic within Haiti and San Domingo is that it's a very tenuous balance, right? It's because the white, sectors need the support of other sectors that they enter into these alliances with different mixed race people, or with, or among the different sectors of the white population, or with the French bureaucracy abroad. All of that is because of the fundamental fact that this is a weak society, right? This is a weak system, and it's weak because it constitutes a tiny minority that seeks to impose its control through domination. Now, this is, again, across the Americas, and Maroonism and Maroon societies, again, all they represent is a more recent attempt to recreate something that was never sufficiently destroyed across the globe, right? Which is collective society, right? So when you have, again, I mentioned the Maroons and the Quilombos in Brazil. You had the Quilombo of Palmares off in the sort of distant backcountry of Brazil that had tens of thousands of people living there, right? This is a civilization, right? This is a society. It's organized, it's structured. This is not something that the colonizers could crush, and so they form a kind of détente with it. They let it exist. They, this context in the U.S., we're signing treaties with Maroon societies, and this is, it's a sign of the overall balance of forces for sure. Yeah. What else?
So there are two questions here. I'm just going to try to put them into one, since they're both fairly short questions. So the first one is, what book best explores the impact of voodoo on the Haitian Revolution, if you know any?
There are some great ones.
And then the second one, where was James at vis-a-vis NLA historians? I believe I'm saying that right. But yeah, where's James at, like, in relation to NLA historians?
In relation to what?
NLA or NLAs?
Analysis. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I don't speak French, but yeah. Okay. These are very different questions. I think I want to hold the best book on voodoo, because I don't want to give an answer that's, like maybe not great. But I will say that there is lots of great literature on the role of voodoo that's been developed, that's been improved, that overcomes a lot of the blind spots that probably James himself was subject to around understanding it, that get closer to it. Right? James. I don't know. I don't want to speak too directly on this, but James, like Du Bois, has a certain kind of distance from what you could call popular consciousness, in the sense of looking at it as something that's very interesting and worth understanding and grasping, but definitely not something they identify with, right? I'm not sure if that comes across super clearly. When Du Bois talks about the coming of the Lord, he said, formerly enslaved people saw abolition and freedom as the coming of the Lord, as religious ecstasy, as, you know what I mean, like in this sort of very religious guise. Du Bois himself didn't feel that way, right? Like, he didn't identify himself with it. He stood at a distance as an analyst, and James reproduces probably some of that when it comes to being very interested in giving sort of voodoo credit as, again, a faith, a cosmology, a means of communication and organization. But more recent literature, will have fleshed that out, I think, better, and understood something that we'll talk about a lot, which is the relative blindness of someone like James to what we could call the exteriority that is beyond the existing system. That sounds hopelessly vague. What I mean by that is he's very focused on the Haitian Revolution as a revolution by enslaved people that seizes power of the state, that takes control of capitalist production, that fails to transform the plantation structure. But there's a whole lot happening on the sideline of that, right? Outside of it. There are different ways of living in terms of Maroon communities, different ways of seeing the world, different ways of understanding what production should look like, that are far beyond and outside of the scope of what James is talking about. It's not necessarily a criticism, but it's something that he doesn't fully spend his work doing, right? And we could say the same thing of Du Bois. So I'll say that about that. And I'll bring some recommendations next week on that if I can. General recommendations around reading about the role of Maroons and their political horizon. A very classic is Carolyn Fick, which I think I mentioned last time, the Making of Haiti, and also other essays on what it was that enslaved and Maroon communities wanted, right? And again, they did not want to continue to work on the same plantations, right? That becomes very clear in the next chapter. The second question was on how does James relate to this very important French school of critical historiography that emerges with like Fernand Braudel analyzing the world system around the Mediterranean, becomes this sort of mode of analysis by folks like Emmanuel Wallerstein, that you may have heard of described as world systems analysis, right? That's building on the analysis tradition. I'm sure there are lots of overlaps. James is writing before a lot of that is fully, I think, sort of incorporated and digested. And he's writing in a way where his reference points are going to be, and I may have mentioned it last week, but apologies if I didn't, much more the sort of social historians that are emerging in and of the French Revolution, right? He's referencing and he's drawing very heavily on the historian Georges Lefebvre, who writes a great history of the French Revolution, who shows the internal dynamics of the poorest sectors. He's going beyond the traditional story that says this is a bourgeois revolution and saying, here's the role that the sans-culottes played, that the masses played, that the sort of like street rebellions of the French poor played, right? This is something that he's building on. It's similar in a lot of senses to the sort of British tradition that people may know of social history, E.P. Thompson and others who are really getting down to the grassroots and thinking hard about how it is that communities lived, what they understood, and finding those sources that allow us to understand, more sort of tap into that kind of understanding. So these traditions are all emerging, not coincidentally, around the same time. James is writing this before a lot of them, but the French, the French approach to the French Revolution is beginning to emerge. It'll become much bigger everywhere in the 50s and 60s, right? This is where everyone is writing social history, rewriting history, what we could call history from below, looking at history from the grassroots, reassessing the role of people and the masses in those histories, not just strictly speaking the proletariat, but broader sectors. So those are, I think, some of the not necessarily influences. There's definitely influences from the French school, but more like dovetails, where he's doing what other people are beginning to do around the same time as well. Cool. Have a lot? Yeah, you can give me a couple more and then we can call it if you want. Yeah. Chat. The chat is defeating the person crew today. If you were here last semester, there's often competition between the questions in the chat and the questions in the room. So
okay. So the question that we have in the chat right now is, can you speak to James's writing style? I'm struck by how he really is setting the story up as a Greek tragedy. Do you think he's trying to energize his audience, or is it just his writing style?
I think the person that asked the question spoke to it, right? You all are reading it. You see what the writing style is, you see the effectiveness of it. The one thing to say is that he, again, if you were here last week, he was deeply, deeply steeped in European civilization and culture, right? He studied tragedy. He studied literature. He references it all the time. So does Du Bois, right? They're very classically trained. James, in some ways, even more so. And so his reference points are going to be not only European, but also this sort of tragic structure. One of the very interesting things about interpretations of so this book was written in 1938, it's revised in 1963. There's an entire argument that the revision makes it more tragic, right? In the revised view, it becomes more tragic. It downplays the romantic individual leader in favor of a tragic mode in which there's this possibility, but then this collapse of that possibility into defeat, right? Again, spoiler alert, Toussaint does not win, right? He does not lead the revolution to its final conclusion, and he meets what could very easily be understood as a tragic kind of fate. But that's already there in the story. James is not adding that in the 1960s. He's maybe adding some references to it, but what he's adding more than anything is not an overarching tragic framing. It's what would have been necessary to move forward further, right? Or who should have been in charge, meaning the grassroots, meaning the masses, meaning the people, right? It's only understood truly as a tragedy if you're really so centered on the individual leadership that you can't grasp what's happening below the surface, right? So yes, he's reading tragic structure into it. At the same time, I think he's being so, he's being inductive, as we've said, to the degree that he's not going to restructure history to make it fit a tragic form, if that makes sense. He will definitely reference it because he loves that shit. You can just give me a couple and then, yeah, and then that'll be good. Are they all good?
No comment. Okay, so the next question is, could you talk a bit more about the Dune or Dune, D-U-N-N-E, school that posed slavery as a mildly resisted phenomenon?
Yes, I mentioned that earlier. We go to the next one. Yeah, this is part of what Du Bois is arguing against, is pushing back on. Yes.
I feel like he answered that.
You can just pick the best ones.
Oh God.
The tech team is just killing it over here, but they have a very hard task, which is that there's all these questions flowing through the chat that they need to filter through.
I feel like you answered this already, but from James's standpoint, writing in the 1930s, what was the value of centering Toussaint as a heroic figure of the Haitian Revolution?
Mm-hmm. The initial value of centering, the question is about what is the value of centering Toussaint? One of the answers is, and the reason that he does want to center him initially, is that he wants to prove that Haiti and that the third world and that the revolutionary sort of global south has great leaders, right? Similar to like arguments around like has great civilizations, has a history, has, all of these things, right? But this also fits into, and becomes complicated in a couple of ways. One is that he starts to realize very quickly it's not actually about the leader, right? Even, the things you've already said. He said, listen, he is produced by these circumstances that allows him to act in a certain kind of way. The second piece is that what was the second piece? What was the question again? So it's about Toussaint as a leader, about centering him. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The advantage. The risk
yes.
the risk is one, that it's not about him, and the second risk is really that it's like ultimately he is bound up in this idea that, as Du Bois puts it, like he's trying to prove Haiti's history according to the criteria offered by Western civilization, right? Again, he's saying Du Bois understood earlier that you don't need to prove this. You can just act as if, and on the knowledge that what happened in Haiti was world historic, right? And it didn't have to be world historic because an individual led it, which was not true anyway, right? If anything, it fits into history, and we'll see this at the very beginning of the, the third chapter? When he says, or maybe it's the fourth chapter. Anyway, he says, like any revolutionary peasants, right? Like any revolutionary peasants, Haitian slaves did this, right? And that's a very important turn of phrase, because what he's saying is, as Du Bois has said, these are ordinary people, right? These are ordinary people confronting situations that if confronted anywhere on earth, they would respond to in the same way, right? Nothing special, nothing, non-human or sort of inferior either, right? Yeah, you can give them both and then we can be done. Yeah, let's do it.
So the first question that we have is, I'm curious if you know what kind of sourcing James was using. I'd like to know if and how much historical oral histories and or legends played into his narrative.
And what was the last part?
I would like to know how much oral histories and or legends played into his narrative. And then the second question is, was there any connection on James's mind between the Haitian Revolution and the Russian Revolution of 1917 as a society based largely on agrarian mode of production?
These are good questions, yeah. First and foremost, his sources are not based on oral histories for the most part, except insofar as you take fucking French history as being the oral history of a bunch of white Frenchmen who were writing about what was going on, right? That is a kind of oral history. Then they wrote it down, whatever. That's all to say, he was really relying on a very insufficient history and very insufficient archive, let's put it that way. He does not have access to the text that he wants to have access to. One of the things he says in 1971 is he wishes he had access to more of the voices of Haitian people, more of the voices of enslaved people, more of the voices certainly of Maroon communities, but these are not being shared and passed along in any way that makes them super easily accessible, especially not to him. Even today, again, you could look at more recent sources and find some of that. There's not a ton. What he was doing though, and he's very self-critical about this, I think too self-critical, because he's saying I cited too many French authors, but I think, and I said this last time, the way he's quoting French authors shows exactly what he knows to be true, right? He's quoting the French authors in a way that show their weaknesses, show that they're not grasping the situation, show that they're failing to uphold the propaganda that they're trying to uphold, so things like that. He's working with the archive that he has. There's ways in which this can distort some of the histories. There's things he says about Toussaint that are not true. I forget which details exactly about his physical appearance, about his history, his background, but he's working with the sources that he has. Connections with the Russian Revolution. He is making connections with the Russian Revolution in his head all the time. That is, in some senses, what he's writing about, right? Because he's writing again in the 30s where he's trying to grapple with what happened in the Russian Revolution, how it happened, but also very importantly, what happened afterward, right? What were the power dynamics? He is going to say Toussaint did this, like Stalin and Trotsky did. You know what I mean? Like he's going to draw direct parallels because that's exactly what he's thinking about. And that's almost the entirety of his political frame of reference, is the Russian Revolution. He wrote this book based on the example provided by Trotsky's history of the Russian Revolution. Not Marxist Capital, not other bits of Marxism, the Russian Revolution. So that is at the center. Now, where he's not drawing as many direct connections is this piece on the economic structure of Russia. He's not saying these were agrarian societies, these were similar in this or that way. They were both non like capitalist or not highly developed capitalist countries. And one of the reasons is probably the fact that he's actually trying to dispute what that would imply, right? In a certain sense. This will probably become clear in a couple of chapters. But he already hinted at it, right? He hinted at it when he said, when these civilized colonizers arrived in Central Africa to enslave these people, this was a more advanced peasantry than existed in feudal Europe, right? He's resisting and he's rejecting this linear conception of history that places Europe at the pinnacle, that says the highest level of development on an economic structural level is happening in Europe, and that everywhere else is peripheral and backwards and agrarian, and therefore. We'll talk a lot about the fact that he calls enslaved Haitians many different things that don't seem to fit together, but he calls them revolutionary peasants and workers, right? These seem like they don't fit together in a Marxist sense, but part of what he's saying is that peasants are revolutionary. Something that Marx did not think. I'll say more about this in a couple of weeks. Marx did not think peasants were revolutionary. The 20th century shows us that peasants are indeed revolutionary, but for some of the same reasons that Marx would have probably guessed or could have guessed according to his own analysis. That's a little cryptic, but maybe we'll leave it there. I think he's not going to say something like, listen, look, Russia's backward, Haiti's backward, therefore this is what the revolution looks like, because he doesn't believe that. He's actually trying to show that the productive apparatus in Haiti is among the most advanced at the moment that that the revolution is taking place. Cool. We'll talk about that more next week when we get into the owners. This is going to be a hoot. You're going to love the owners, let me tell you. And when we begin to see the disintegration of the sort of alliance at the top of global society that he laid out, right? The San Domingo planters, the French bourgeoisie, and the British bourgeoisie. He said as long as that alliance holds together, or not alliance, as long as this equilibrium holds, there would be no opportunity for enslaved people to act. The equilibrium does not hold, right? It breaks wide open, and it creates a historical breach into which the Haitian people and Toussaint can step. Next week. See you all then. Thank you.